When a black homeless man steps in to help a young boy, he discovers a shocking connection with the father's past. Bob sat in the park, leaning against the rough bark of an old oak tree. It was the only place where the chaos of the world seemed to fade away, giving him a brief moment of peace. He closed his eyes, letting the cool autumn breeze wash over him. But that peace was quickly shattered by the sound of cruel laughter. Bob opened his eyes, and his gaze shifted toward the playground. A small boy, no more than 8, was surrounded by a group of older boys. The boy, his face pale with fear, clutched his backpack tightly, as if it was the only thing protecting him. "Please stop," the boy whimpered, his voice barely audible over the taunts of the bullies. Bob gripped the worn fabric of his coat. His instinct told him to stay out of it, to avoid trouble, but something held him back. He saw the leader of the group, a tall boy with a sneer, shove the smaller boy hard, sending him stumbling to the ground. "Think you're better than us because your daddy's rich?" The leader sneered, kicking dirt into the boy's face. The others laughed, egging him on. Bob's heart pounded in his chest. He recognized that look in the bully's eyes all too well. It was the same look he'd seen in his own reflection when he was younger. Angry, lost, and hurting. But this kid didn't deserve this. No one did. Without thinking, Bob rose from his spot under the tree and began walking toward the group. His steps were slow but deliberate, each one echoing in his mind like a countdown. "Hey!" Bob called out, his voice firm but calm. The bullies didn't hear him at first, too caught up in their cruel game. "I said hey!" The leader finally looked up, his amusement fading into irritation. "What do you want, old man?" he sneered, trying to cover his surprise with bravado. "Leave him alone," Bob said, locking eyes with the bullies. He didn't raise his voice, but there was an edge to his tone that made the boys pause. "And who's gonna make us?" one of the other boys taunted, though he took a step back, unsure of the man standing before them. Bob didn't answer. He just stood there, his gaze steady, as if daring them to test him. For a moment, there was silence. In that silence, the leader seemed to realize that this wasn't a fight worth picking. "Come on, let's go," the leader muttered, shoving his hands into his pockets. He turned away, and the others reluctantly followed. "This kid's not worth it." Bob watched them leave, his muscles tense until they were out of sight. Only then did he turn his attention to the boy on the ground. "You all right, kid?" Bob asked, his voice softening as he knelt beside him. The boy looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. He nodded, but his small frame was trembling. Bob held out his hand, and after a moment of hesitation, the boy took it, letting Bob help him to his feet. "Thank you," the boy whispered, clutching his backpack tightly. "I didn't know what to do." "You don't need to thank me," Bob said, brushing some dirt off the boy's shoulder. "Those kids are just bullies. They're not as tough as they act." The boy nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I'm Ethan," he said, his voice still shaky. "Bob," he replied with a small smile, "you shouldn't be out here alone. Where's your folks?" "My dad's coming to pick me up," Ethan said, glancing nervously around the park, as if expecting the bullies to return at any moment. Bob looked around for the first time, noticing the expensive clothes Ethan was wearing and the high-end backpack slung over his shoulder. This kid came from a different world, far removed from Bob's reality, but at this moment, it didn't matter. "All right," Bob said, his voice steady and reassuring. "How about I wait with you until he gets here?" Ethan's eyes brightened, and he nodded eagerly. Bob led him over to the bench where he had been sitting earlier, and they sat down together. The tension in the air slowly dissipated. They didn't talk much after that, but the silence was comfortable. Ethan seemed to relax, knowing someone was there to protect him. Bob kept an eye on the park entrance, half expecting trouble to find them again. Minutes passed, and finally, a sleek black car pulled up at the edge of the park. Ethan's face lit up, and he jumped to his feet. Bob stood as well, watching as a tall man in a sharp suit stepped out of the car, his eyes immediately locking onto Ethan. "Dad!" Ethan called, running over to him. The man's stern expression softened as he knelt to hug his son. "Are you okay? What happened?" Ethan pointed back at Bob, who was standing a few steps away, hands shoved into his pockets. "This is Bob," Ethan said. "He helped me when some kids were picking on me." The man, James West, stood up and looked at Bob, his expression hardening slightly. "Thank you for helping my son," he said, his tone polite but distant. Bob nodded, his eyes meeting James's briefly before dropping to the ground. Just glad he's all right." James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder and started guiding him toward the car. "We need to get going, Ethan. Say goodbye." Ethan looked back at Bob, a small frown on his face. "Bye, Bob. Thank you." "Take care, kid," Bob replied, forcing a smile. He watched as they got into the car and drove off, leaving him alone once more in the park. As the sound of the car faded into the distance, Bob let out a long breath and turned back to his spot under the tree. He sat down, pulling his coat tighter around him as the autumn wind began to pick up. The world moved on, just as it always did. But today, for a brief moment, Bob had made a difference. He leaned back against the tree, closing his eyes. Tomorrow, the struggle would continue, but at least for now, he had something to hold on to, a reminder that, despite everything, he could still do some good in this world. Bob stayed in the park, the adrenaline of the encounter slowly fading, leaving behind a dull ache in his bones. He hadn't been in a fight, but the tension and the memories it dredged up left him weary. He thought the boy would have left with his father without looking back, but instead, he felt a presence beside him. Opening his eyes, he found Ethan standing there, clutching his backpack tightly. "Can I sit with you?" Ethan asked, his voice small and uncertain. Bob raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Shouldn't you be with your dad?" Ethan glanced toward the park entrance where the car had driven off. "He's coming back. He just had to take a call." Bob nodded slowly. He wasn't used to people sticking around after they got what they needed from him. But there was something in the boy's eyes, curiosity maybe, or gratitude, that kept Bob from brushing him off. He shifted over on the bench, making room. "Sure, kid. Take a seat." Ethan climbed onto the bench, his legs swinging above the ground. For a moment, they sat in silence, the sounds of the park filling the gap between them. Bob was content to let it be, but he could feel the boy's eyes on him, as if Ethan was trying to figure out something he couldn't quite grasp. "Why did you help me?" Ethan asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. Bob didn't answer right away. He wasn't used to explaining himself, especially not to a kid, but something about Ethan's earnestness made him consider the question seriously. "Because you needed help," Bob said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "No one should have to face that alone." Ethan frowned, as if trying to understand. "But you don't even know me." Bob chuckled softly, the sound more of a breath than anything else. "Don't need to. Helping someone doesn't mean you have to know them. Sometimes it's enough to just be there." Ethan seemed to mull over this, his brows furrowed in thought. "Do you live here?" he asked, looking around the park as if expecting to find a hidden house among the trees. "In a way," Bob replied, avoiding the question directly. "I'm around here a lot." Ethan didn't press further, but Bob could see the wheels turning in the boy's mind. There was a sharpness to Ethan's gaze that reminded Bob of himself at that age, always questioning, always trying to make sense of the world. "Do you have kids?" Ethan asked, surprising Bob again with his directness. "No, I don't," Bob said, shaking his head. "Never had a family like that." "Why not?" Ethan asked, tilting his head in curiosity. Bob hesitated, caught off guard by the innocent question. How could he explain the choices, the mistakes, the twists of fate that had led him to this point? He didn't want to burden the boy with his life story, a story filled with more downs than ups. "Life just didn't turn out that way for me," Bob said simply, hoping that would be enough. Ethan seemed to sense that this was a topic best left alone, and he nodded, his attention shifting back to the park. They sat quietly for a few moments, the comfortable silence returning. After a while, Ethan spoke again, his voice a bit softer. "Do you get lonely?" Bob blinked, taken aback by the question. Loneliness was something he had grown accustomed to, something he rarely acknowledged, even to himself. It was like an old coat he wore daily, frayed at the edges but familiar. "Sometimes," Bob admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, "but you get used to it." Ethan didn't say anything right away. Instead, he pulled his backpack onto his lap, fiddling with the zipper. "I get lonely too," he said finally, his voice so quiet Bob almost didn't hear it. Bob looked at the boy, surprised. Ethan had a father who clearly cared for him, a life that, from the outside, seemed full of everything a kid could need. But loneliness didn't discriminate. It crept into the hearts of the wealthy and the poor alike. "Why do you feel lonely?" Bob asked gently, careful not to pry too deeply. Ethan shrugged, his eyes downcast. My dad's always busy. He's a lawyer, so he works a lot. I don't get to see him much. Bob nodded, understanding more than he let on. He knew what it was like to want someone's time and attention, only to find they were always out of reach. It was a different kind of loneliness, but just as painful. He cares about you, though, Bob said, trying to offer some comfort. You can tell just by how he rushed over here when he knew you were in trouble. Ethan smiled faintly at that, though the sadness didn't completely leave his eyes. Yeah, I know, but I wish he wasn't so busy all the time. Bob didn't have a solution for that. He couldn't tell the kid that things would magically get better, or that his dad would suddenly have more time. Life didn't work that way, and Bob wasn't one for giving false hope. Instead, he reached over and gave Ethan's shoulder a gentle squeeze. You're a strong kid, Bob said. Don't forget that. Ethan looked up at Bob, his eyes wide and searching. For a moment, it seemed like he was going to say something, but before he could, the sound of footsteps interrupted them. James West was walking back toward them, his phone in hand. The frown on his face softened when he saw Ethan. He pocketed the phone and approached the bench, giving Bob a polite nod. Thank you for keeping an eye on him, James said, his tone still formal but less distant than before. No problem, Bob replied, standing up from the bench. Just glad he's safe. James placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, guiding him off the bench. We should get going, Ethan. Ethan didn't move right away. He looked up at Bob, a question in his eyes, but whatever it was, he didn't ask it. Instead, he just nodded, his small hand gripping his father's larger one. Will I see you again? Ethan asked, his voice hopeful. Bob glanced at James, who watched him carefully before turning back to Ethan. Maybe. Take care, all right? Ethan smiled, a small, genuine smile, before he allowed his father to lead him away. Bob watched them go, his heart a little lighter than it had been before. As they walked away, Ethan glanced back over his shoulder and waved. Bob raised a hand in return, a rare smile tugging at his lips. He stayed in the park until the sun dipped below the horizon, the last traces of daylight disappearing. For the first time in a long while, Bob felt that the loneliness he carried wasn't as heavy as it usually was. He had made a connection, however brief, with someone who saw him not as a homeless man, but as a person who had made a difference. And that, for now, was enough. How do you think this encounter will change Bob's life moving forward? I hope this story touched your soul. If it did, please subscribe. Your support means everything to me, and it helps me keep sharing these wonderful stories with you.